The Guardian has published a story drawing attention to the fact that the Queen can have input into the laws going through Parliament. Rebecca, so tell us, what did that Guardian story say?
In a nutshell, the Guardian's uncovered papers which they believe show that the Queen's lawyers lobbied government ministers to change draft legislation to hide details of her private wealth, namely stocks and shares and things like that, from the public. Now, obviously, these documents relate almost 50 to events 50 years ago in the 1970s, but they believe it's an example of the monarchy using something called Queen's consent, which allows them to affect draft law before it becomes legislation, which they believe is obviously unconstitutional. That's what their argument would be. Buckingham Palace, of course, deny this. They say this is parliamentary procedure. There really is nothing to see here. And the Queen has never attempted to block legislation in her life.
One man who knows more about the inner workings of the royal finances than most is biographer David McClure. We spoke to him about the Queen's monetary matters and why she can't be treated like any private citizen.
The Queen's consent is a rather arcane procedure that basically allows the Queen to stop or change a piece of legislation before it completes all the stages in the parliamentary process. Now, this only applies to two sorts of laws. First of all, laws that affect the royal prerogative. That's another fancy word that basically means the special powers of the Queen, such as the powers to dissolve Parliament. The other sort of legislation is laws that affect the Queen's private property and private financial interests. But what is striking about the Guardian story is not so much that the Queen used the Queen's consent, because that is almost automatic and it's her right to do it, but it's the way in which she used this power. First of all, it's slightly unusual that she didn't send her own top courtier. Normally, it would be the role of the private secretary to represent the Queen in liaison with the government. But on this occasion, she used her own private lawyers from Paris. Secondly, it's the way in which the lawyers went about their business. It's quite interesting from the government papers that the language that was used, that they talked about the Queen being concerned, they talked about it being embarrassing, they talked about sort of risks, and they also used statements like, the government got us into this quandary and it's up to the government to get us out of this quandary. What's interesting about the story is that it fits into a wider pattern of behavior going on for, 40 or 50 years, where the Queen has appeared to be reluctant to disclose the total size of her wealth. You saw this, first of all, in 1971, when there was a big parliamentary inquiry into reforming the financing of the royal family. And on that occasion, MPs made repeated attempts to get a precise figure for her private worth, and they got no joy out of the palace. This happened again in 1989, when there was a similar attempt to reform the financing of the royal household, this time by a Treasury committee. Again, they made representation to the palace to try and get a figure about her worth, and again, they got no joy. This can only mean that when it comes to the monarch and her private money, it's one of the red lines which you cannot cross. Well, what's interesting about the story, I suppose, is the word embarrassing. That's the word often used by her lawyers. Now, it begs the question, why is it embarrassing? Is it embarrassing because the nature of the actual investments in which firms, we presume the Queen only has investments in good and proper blue chip UK companies. But if it came to pass that the investments, one or two of the investments were in slightly less savory firms, yes, that would be embarrassing. And of course, there is a precedent for that, because about 4 years ago, there was something called the Paradise Papers that revealed that the Queen's private estate, the Duchy of Lancaster, had investments in offshore, in tax havens. And some of the money in that investment was actually in firms in Britain. And two of those firms were a little bit dodgy, and indeed, they later went bust. The bulk of the Queen's wealth has actually been derived from tax breaks granted by the government, which do not go to any private citizen. For instance, when it comes to inheritance tax, she hasn't paid inheritance tax on getting Balmoral and Sandringham. When it comes to her private estate, the Duchy of Lancaster, she doesn't pay corporation tax or capital gains tax. And when it comes to more personal matters, for the first 40 years of her reign, she didn't pay any income tax nor tax on her investment income. Private wealth has always been a tricky issue, not just for the Queen, but for all members of the royal family, because, you know, their job is to get their message across. They need to communicate or to connect to the mass of the population. You know, hence we don't see images of members of the royal family shooting grouse or lounging on luxury liners, because at the end of the day, the Queen wants to appear less rich than she actually is.
Richard Eden, coming to you. Now, this mechanism has actually been in place for decades, but do you think people are surprised at how regularly the Queen appears to have used it?
Yes, what I found interesting was the number of times. So I think, according to the Guardian's calculations, Queen's consent had been used more than 1,000 times during the Queen's reign, which works out about sort of 14 times a year. But it is just a sort of matter of course. And, you know, we need to be clear, you know, the Guardian is a Republican paper. But having said that, I think the royal family do need to be careful. We discussed it the other week with the question of changes to leaseholds, where the government's trying to give people rights to buy the lease on their property. And there were suggestions that there was going to be an exemption for the royal family from that legislation, and they will have seen the law via Queen's consent. And so I think they do need to bear in mind that, yes, they've got this power, but it needs to be used carefully.
Richard Kay, now David spoke there of a suggestion by the former MP Norman Baker that the Queen's financial interests should be a matter of public record, the same as with MPs. What do you think of that move going forward?
Well, we're all fascinated by how rich the Queen is, how rich the Prince of Wales might be, but aren't the royal family entitled to the same degree of privacy about their private income like the rest of us? You know, do we need to know everything about how the Queen makes her money, where she spends it, how she chooses to invest it? I think it's a fine line between what she should tell us as monarch and as head of state, and which there is an obligation on her to reveal, and what she is entitled to keep private. And I think the more that we know about her private side of her income, the more difficult it becomes for them to sort of maintain any kind of privacy, if you like, about a very important element of their life. I mean, we're brought up to think that our own private income and what we give to the taxman is a matter between us and the taxman. We'd all be pretty fed up if our income was sort of public for public consumption. And I think the same argument applies to the Queen. Having said that, you know, the Queen's wealth has been an enduring source of fascination ever since she came to the throne.
I suppose the counterpoint to that privacy argument would be that even the Queen's private income is something that has, you know, been gained through sort of like, you know, the ordaining of birth, the birthright, and you know, historical public funds.
Well, that goes to the whole argument, if you like, about monarchy. I mean, whose possessions does she have in trust? Are they ours or are they hers? And the whole manner in which the royal family has accumulated its wealth. I mean, it goes back almost 1,000 years. It certainly goes back to the reign of King Henry VIII, when they began becoming quite as acquisitive as they were. But that, you know, at what point do you say, well, okay, this is royal family money, or this is our money? I mean, the assumption is that the royal collection, for example, is a marvelous collection of treasures and art that the Queen has, is in fact, she runs it on behalf of the nation. It's not her. She can't buy and sell it. She can't get a new dishwasher by flogging off a Degas or anything like that. You know, they belong to the country. And sometimes these things get conflated into her private wealth. And I think there is a lot of, you know, wicked reporting at times around the Queen and her money, often from Republican-leaning publications like The Guardian.
Richard Eden, the use of lawyers by the palace to communicate with the government does seem to be particularly contentious. Well, what do you make of that?
I'm not sure it is contentious, really. I mean, come on, the Queen, if she's been shown this legislation and how it could affect royal interests or have an impact, she needs her lawyers to look at that. I mean, you know, yes, the Queen's a very experienced woman, but she's not a legal expert and she might not know what implications it has. So I presume they're there to advise and then I guess pass on those concerns to the government. I don't see that as a sinister thing particularly.
So Richard Kay, we recently discussed the Prince Charles's Duchy of Cornwall and how much money that is all worth. If the Queen has a lot more money than the public actually thinks, that's something that is going to change the perception of the monarchy, isn't it?
Well, it might change the perception of the monarchy if she was seen to being a spendthrift, if she was lavishing money on expensive possessions. But the fact is, the Queen doesn't. I mean, she's very modest in her taste. Yes, she has all these fabulous homes and palaces, some of which are owned by the state, some of which are privately owned. But she's not someone who goes out and spends vast sums of money. She's clearly a rich woman. And I believe, and I think David touched on this, that the best estimate of her wealth is in the sort of 300 to 400 million category. Well, if you look at for example, the Sunday Times rich list, that doesn't put her anywhere very high. I think around about 372 of the top 1,000 people in the country. So yes, she's rich by many people's standards, but she's not on oligarch scale.
Yeah, poor the Queen.